Hey, what up? It's Persian Nicole back at it again. I am super excited to welcome you back to the virtual Why Women Cry conference series. I hope that you all enjoy session number 2, Women's Health, My Womb, My Power, My Love. And it's only going to get better from here. Let me tell you this, get ready for today's session and turn your life around. You know, when the coronavirus that caused COVID-19 first started to spread, virtually nobody was immune, meaning no resistance. You know, the virus spread quickly across communities, our culture. Stopping it will require a significant percentage of people to be immune. But how can we get to that point? That's the real question, right? So today's session will address the concerns and questions you might have during COVID. Crowd effect is being moderated by Dr. CHIDINMA. She will also be introducing our panelists who are experts of areas in the field of public health, along with all the special guest artists. And now you want to see the Why Women Cry conference series is not just about surviving, but it's really about thriving. It's not just about making it, but of course, about making it happen and making it happen together. You protect me, I protect you, making certain that all of us are helping each other to get vaccinated as we are still striving to get through this pandemic together. Something new for all of us, right? We thrive and we dance in the face of fear with purpose and passion. That's it. That is all. For those of you who want to live with passion and purpose and step up to the table, make sure your presence is known. Be a history maker, okay? You know, share your story. Be that woman that you know you can be. This is our moment. This is our movement. This as our magic. Stay tuned and of course, grab some knowledge of COVID. That is power. COVID is power. That's what it's all about, right? Be sure to hit that share button and bring another sister who needs to learn, live, and laugh. This is Why Women Cry 2021.
Hey, everybody. It is so good to be in the house. And you know what? We were actually just making sure that was a sound check for you to make sure that you were listening and actually paying attention. We want to welcome you back to session number 3 of Why Women Cry Virtual Conference 2021. There has never been a situation like this before. And Reverend Deb and I said that we were going to come to you this year. We know you couldn't come to us. We were going to make sure that we came to you. We are right next to you even right now, and glad that you have made it to session number 3, which is COVID crowd effect. These are incredible conversations that we are having. We, as coming out to you, we step up and then we step back. That is what these conversations are all about. We have great educators, experts, and entertainers. Session number 3 is like something you have never heard before. And we have an incredible moderator who is coming today. Dr. CHIDINMA. She is the Associate Director of the Stakeholder Engagement and Assistant Professor out of the Department of Medicine at Johns Hopkins University. We want you right now to welcome her. I am going to step back as my sister, Dr. steps up.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. It's just so wonderful to be here with you all and to welcome you to the 3rd session of STAR's Why Women Cry conference, the theme of which I think you all know is passion and purpose, dancing in the face of fear. And as Carmi so nicely put it, our session today focuses on COVID-19. And so I'm really honored to be joined by our panelists, Dr. RISHA IRVIN and Dr. Karen KOTLOFF. I'm going to first introduce my colleague, Dr. IRVIN. Dr. IRVIN is an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine in the Division of Infectious Diseases, and she focuses her clinical care, research, and community engagement projects on improving the health of vulnerable populations, populations that have been impacted by HIV and/or hepatitis C virus, or HCV. Dr. IRVIN obtained her bachelor's degree in biology from Spelman College and her medical degree and master's in public health from Harvard School of Medicine and Harvard School of Public Health. Dr. IRVIN completed her residency training in internal medicine at the University of California, San Francisco. She has served as an HIV Prevention Trials Network Scholar and a Presidential Leadership Scholar. She has also received the Herbert W. Nickens Faculty Fellowship from the Association of American Medical Colleges. At Johns Hopkins, she is Associate Vice Chair for Diversity and Inclusion for the Department of Medicine, and she's the Director of the Baltimore HIV Collaboratory for the Center for AIDS Research, where she leads pipeline programs. Dr. IRVIN leads Sharing the Cure, which trains primary care, substance use, and HIV providers to treat HCV infection. Her current research focuses on HCV elimination in incarcerated persons. Additionally, Dr. IRVIN has been working with the COVID-19 Prevention Trials Network on community engagement, both locally and nationally. And she also serves on the COVID-19 Vaccine Health Equity Group at Johns Hopkins Medicine. Welcome, Dr. IRVIN.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here today. And thank you so much to STAR for putting this amazing conference on and allowing us to bring our information to you about COVID-19. I think we're going to bring up some slides now so I can quickly walk through some of the information that we know about COVID-19 and also focused on kind of health disparities and other issues. So we'll allow those. So, over this last year or so, we've been in this pandemic and just always want to remind everyone about the factors that we know that increase community spread and individual risk, such as crowded situations, close physical contact, enclosed space, and the duration of exposure. Next slide. So then it's important for us to think about who is at risk for severe COVID. Next slide. So just want to highlight some of these factors as we think about COVID and who is most likely to have severe disease leading to morbidity and mortality, hospitalization, and death. So we know older patients, male patients, and I think that's really important because as women, we're often the caretakers of our communities, and many times kind of the male figures in our life, whether that be our grandfathers or fathers or brothers or partners, sometimes don't engage in the care that they need. And so it's important, that we also be a champion for them. There are other risk factors such as hypertension and heart disease, diabetes, obesity, lung disease, cancer, and chronic kidney disease. Many of the comorbidities are other factors that we see in populations in Baltimore. And so it makes us at heightened concern for a severe disease of COVID-19. Next slide. So this slide really just hits home on kind of the age factor, starting from the young going all the way to the old. It just shows kind of the case fatality rates by age. So who is kind of having kind of morbidity and dying from COVID-19. And so this comes into play, and later there'll be more information on COVID-19 vaccines, but why initially they were prioritized for older individuals because that's where we were seeing the most deaths. Next slide. So now I want to take a second to acknowledge what COVID-19 has done in people of color. And I think this should outrage us all and make us demand that all parties work to kind of decrease health disparities and kind of turn this tide. So when we look at this slide, and the two things I really want to pull out here are kind of the hospitalization and death rates. And so if we look at people of color for hospitalizations, for American Indian or Alaskan Native, Black or African American, and Latinx populations, you see that the hospitalization rate is almost 3 times that of white non-Hispanic persons, and that the death rate in these groups for all is about 2 times that of non-Hispanic white persons. So again, we see these health disparities, and I do want to say that COVID-19 didn't create these health disparities. We have known for years that these have existed, and I know many of you have been doing the work around this in the community, but I do think this opened the eyes of some who didn't accept that health disparities existed, and COVID-19 gave a portal of entry for people to look at that. Next slide. So again, looking at this impact, so we know these health disparities exist. And so wanted to highlight this slide on the African-American community. So early on, it was documented that about 1/3 of African-Americans reported that someone close to them has died of COVID. That's huge. And the personal connection to COVID in many African-American families cannot be avoided. And that has led to both grief, depression, fear, anxiety, to an already, for many, a life that was already compounded by the stress of systemic racism in our country. This is a quote that I found when I was just reading an article. Every time you look up, there's another rest in peace post, a friend seeking prayers for their loved one who is battling this cruel virus, said Deisha Hartgrove of Detroit. who lost her husband to COVID-19. And this was back in March of 2020. And so this quote comes from last summer when we were still really in the thick of COVID-19 and just showing kind of the devastation that it was ravaging on communities. Next slide. So when we think of that impact, I think, centralized here, I put in the middle of the slide kind of stress, because that's what people have felt. And that's come from seeing kind of death and destruction, social isolation, the financial hardships, and the fear of disease. So creating this nexus of stress in communities. And so it's not just battling kind of the virus and COVID-19, but these other factors that have played into kind of the situation and what we've been living in. Next slide. So I also want to talk about the proposed reasons for health disparities related to COVID-19. And many of these reasons can be applied to many other disease states as well. So one of the things was that when COVID first hit, there was a differential risk in terms of who was being exposed to the virus. And a lot of this had to do with who was allowed to work from home and who was being told that they were essential workers and had to stay on their jobs to keep the system moving. And so then had increased exposure to COVID-19. And what we saw in the early days of COVID was that Black and African Americans had that higher case rate. That has essentially come down over the course of COVID-19 as well. There's also well documented in communities differential access to healthcare and insurance, and this has played out in Black and Brown communities for decades, and also has a direct impact on many of our Latinx and immigrant populations. I think we can't talk about this without talking about structural racism and how that has impacted health and healthcare. With respect to COVID-19, higher density neighborhoods often linked to kind of higher rates of, home loans, segregating our city, and redlining in the segregation, which was actually federally mandated in many cities, including kind of Baltimore, when they gave ranking systems to certain areas of the city, which concentrated poverty, less access to healthcare, and infectious diseases in several parts of the city. The other social determinants of health are also important when we talk about this. And when we think about housing, such as multi-generational homes, poverty, and other comorbidities that have also led to these health disparities that we see in relation to COVID-19. Next slide. So this is a big slide, but again, I just want to hammer home the importance of systemic racism. I think too often times in our country, we don't acknowledge kind of the root of health disparities and the problems that we see in health and healthcare. And this slide goes into that a bit, and I won't read all of it, but the point is that many of the things that have been done in terms of medical and scientific research have led to distrust in the medical establishment. We also know that language and communication barriers exist. Healthcare provider bias has been well documented, and other issues involving structural and institutional racism that have played out in both the physical and environmental contexts, which have led to disparate health outcomes across multiple diseases, and including COVID-19 as well. Next slide. And so now kind of want to shift. So as we think about some of those issues that have led to kind of disparities in COVID-19, now we know that we have moved into a period where we can talk about COVID-19 vaccines. And we're going to hear from Dr. KOTLOFF next, and she's going to give you more information on vaccines. But what I wanted to touch on is kind of some of the issues as vaccines have rolled out around kind of vaccine hesitancy. And what I do want to say is that, in the medical and scientific community, that we are too quick to sometimes label people anti-vaccine, when really it just is that people want information on vaccines and want to know about the process, the data that we have, how they were tested, and we should always be willing and happy to answer any and every question that people have about vaccines so that they can make informed decisions about the COVID-19 vaccine. Our country has a long history of medical and scientific distrust due to things, yes, such as the Tuskegee experiment, but also due to kind of other kind of research that has been done on community and results not being communicated back. And although also the day-to-day interactions that people have with the health and healthcare system. And those things have caused the situation. And so it's incumbent upon the medical and research community to address it head on. Now, there is concern that if we don't have vaccines in certain communities and subpopulations, that we will essentially have immune inequality, where some people are protected from COVID-19 and others are not. And that is something that we want to hopefully avoid. Next slide. So this slide shows kind of the pandemic's racial disparities and how they persist in kind of our vaccine rollout. And just wanted to show this because essentially what it shows kind of all the states kind of ranked, and it looks at both their share of the Black population and the general population, and then the share of the Black population in terms of who had been vaccinated. If you'll see, if you go all the way to the bottom, you'll see Mississippi at the bottom, where their Black population was approaching nearly 40%. But at the time of this data, the Black population had only gotten about 26% of the vaccine allotment. In Maryland, we were kind of the fourth up, and you'll see there was also a racial gap in the African-American community in terms of who had gotten the vaccine. Now, these numbers have improved, but we're still not where we need to be. And so again, it's important that people have the information that they need so that they might make informed decisions about the COVID-19 vaccine. Next slide. So then that brings us to this concept of health equity. How can we ensure that people reach their highest level of health? And Healthy People defines it. So we want to achieve health equity really requires valuing everyone equally with focused and ongoing societal efforts to address avoidable inequalities, historical and contemporary injustices, and the elimination of health and healthcare disparities. And so this applies to the COVID-19 vaccine rollout, but really a host of other conditions as well that we need to think about in our city, in our state, and in our country. Next slide. And so wanted to highlight a few things that I know have been done at both Johns Hopkins and University of Maryland, and really across our city by community-based organizations. And so that's focusing on COVID-19 vaccine community education. There have been many entities kind of working on this across our city. Listening sessions to understand community concerns. Both the local health departments and the major health systems have been involved in this. We've done kind of an inventory across our health system to try to foster collaboration and to make sure that different researchers and other clinicians kind of really knew what each other were doing so that we could intersect and work together. There have been partnerships across the health systems to focus on COVID-19, faith and race, establishments of COVID-19 health equity groups, really partnerships with the city and state government to try to tackle these issues. And the Baltimore City Health Department has played a very large role in this and really working to tailor vaccine education and vaccine mobile units. And that brings up the point of kind of vaccine clinics and mobile vaccine units, really transitioning from these max vaccination sites to kind of vaccine clinics and mobile vaccine units that are really tailored to work with different subpopulations and communities of color. But I think finally the point to be made is that health equity must go beyond COVID-19. We can't just work to get people vaccinated for COVID-19 and then pull out of communities and not do more. This is a moment in time where I think it's incumbent upon all of us to say, we've got to come together and work on these structural issues that led to the disparities that we see in COVID-19 and move into all of the other comorbidities that we need to work on so that we can ensure health equity, really in Baltimore and beyond. So again, thank you for this time today, and just really happy to be here today to talk in this forum. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Irvin. That was such an informative presentation. And personally, I really loved the way that you described COVID-19 as providing a portal into the impact of longstanding health disparities, that they're not new, that they're kind of exacerbated by existing conditions. So thanks so much for clarifying that and really illuminating the state of how things are right now with this pandemic. I'm going to shift gears and welcome Dr. KOTLOFF to also join us. It's wonderful to have her with us. And by way of introduction, Dr. Karen KOTLOFF is Professor of Pediatrics, Medicine, Epidemiology, and Public Health. She serves as Principal Investigator of the NIH-funded Vaccine Treatment and Evaluation Unit at the University of Maryland School of Medicine, and Associate Director for Clinical Research at the university's Center for Vaccine Development and Global Health. She leads clinical trials to evaluate vaccines against a wide range of infections in the US and in developing countries, including 2 large ongoing trials of COVID vaccines. Dr. KOTLOFF also leads multiple studies in Africa to understand and prevent child mortality. And on a personal note, my parents are from Nigeria, so I thank you for your work in sub-Saharan Africa. In 2005, Dr. KOTLOFF was knighted for her work in Mali, that led to the introduction of childhood vaccines. She has published over 250 manuscripts in peer-reviewed journals, and so it's really our pleasure to have you join us as well this morning.
Well, thank you so much for that great introduction, Dr. Ibe. And I want to thank the organizers, STAR, for inviting me to this exciting conference. And I'm really looking forward to hearing lots of very interesting discussions. So what I am going to try to do is give kind of an introduction to some of the main issues related to COVID vaccines and what they are able to do. So if I could have the first slide. This curve looks at the evolution of the COVID epidemic in the United States. And so far, we have had 33 million cases and over 500,000 deaths due to COVID. The good part of this curve is what you can see all the way to the right, which is the current June 2021, is that the cases, the number of cases, which are the blue bars, have fallen almost to the baseline when the pandemic started taking off. And the 7-day average, which is the red line, of course, has fallen accordingly in the United States. So this is terrific news. And we think it's a combination of people listening to social distancing and masks, to vaccine introduction, and also because we're entering into a warmer season and the virus doesn't seem to like warm seasons quite as much. Next slide, please. But the pictures on this slide are a picture of the world, and we always have to remember that we are part of a global community, not only because we care about what's happening to people all over the world, but also because COVID viruses that are circulating in Africa and Latin America and other parts of the world make their way to the United States and have an impact. And so what you can see on this global map in the top right corner is that right now the pandemic is actually raging in Africa, and especially in the southern parts of Africa and also in Latin America. And so that's where they're experiencing cooler weather and where they have the introduction of variants of viruses. And I'll explain that to you. And as a result, these curves, so the pink curve is the number of cases in the world, and the gray curve is the number of deaths. And that's not dipping down as low as we're seeing in the United States. And in fact, we may be seeing an uptick. Next slide, please. So why is this occurring? And this is a picture that I came across yesterday for the first time, and it just amazed me. So the red is a cell. It's one of the cells in a human body. And all of the little yellow dots are viruses that are invading this cell. And so you can just get a picture of the war that's going on inside the body of somebody who has a COVID infection. And what happens when each of those viruses, what we call replicate, make new viruses, they copy their genetic material, but they make mistakes in that copying. It's not perfect. And what happens is that what we call variants, so slightly different viruses, emerge. And of those viruses, the ones that survive the best and the longest are the ones that start spreading around the community. And so this is how variants of concern come about. And there are now 4 variants of concern that we're particularly concerned about, and they've been renamed to try to make our lives a bit easier to understand them: alpha, beta, gamma, and delta. And these strains are the ones that are more contagious, and there's evidence that they're causing widespread disease and outbreaks and increasing number of cases rapidly. So they're kind of taking over. In fact, the original form of the COVID virus doesn't exist on the earth anymore. These variants keep taking over in waves. And they tend to cause more severe disease, or maybe even different unusual manifestations of COVID. And they also affect the effectiveness of the treatments that we have, the diagnostic tests that we have, and the vaccines that we have. So we're fighting against them, and they're racing to get away from our interventions, and we're racing to stay on top of them with our interventions. So just to give you a little primer of the 4 variants we're seeing, alpha is the one that started in the UK, and that is dominant in the US. It's about 60% of the strains. And then delta is the one that we're keeping our eye on, and that's the one that came from India. And right now it's 10% of all the strains circulating in the US, but it's doubling very, very quickly. And they're the 2 strains that are taking over, at least in our country and in a lot of the world. The other 2 strains, beta is the South African strain. We were very worried about it, but it didn't take off in this country so much. And then the gamma strain is the one in Brazil and also in Japan that we've heard a bit about. Next slide, please. So what tools do we have in terms of vaccines to be able to prevent these infections? Well, there are now 3 vaccines that are available by EUA, that's emergency use authorization, and that is a special sort of rapid, not quite licensure, it's called authorization, that is invoked in the instance of a pandemic by the government. It allows for more rapid availability of vaccines when they pass certain criteria, when they're shown to be safe and effective by a lot of data, by the same processes for developing vaccines that we normally follow, even though it's been accelerated by overlapping steps, not by skipping steps. So the 3 vaccines that we have now are the Pfizer vaccine, the Moderna vaccine, and the Johnson & Johnson vaccines. And the Pfizer and Moderna are the messenger RNA vaccines, and Johnson & Johnson is based on an adenovirus vector. And I don't have time today to go into that. Maybe I'll be lucky enough one day you'll invite me back and I can explain how these vaccines were developed and what they look like. But the first 2 are given as 2 shots a few weeks apart, 3 to 4 weeks apart. And the Johnson & Johnson is 1 shot. Next dose. No, next slide, please. And what we know from big trials and now millions and millions of people who have gotten these 3 vaccines is that the 2 messenger RNA vaccines are 95% effective. And they both show data to support that they're effective down to 12 years of age, all the way up to the highest age groups. The J&J vaccine is about 72% effective, a little bit less. But what is important is that all 3 of these vaccines are highly effective against severe disease, and that includes hospitalization and death. And that is really the primary goal that we want from a vaccine is to stop people from dying, and then we can roll it back and see, well, does it prevent mild disease, moderate disease, and look at it a little bit better. And we're also gathering data to see how well all of these do against the new variants. Next slide, please. So I was asked to make a few comments about herd immunity, and this little graph shows that little star is a person who comes into a community infected with COVID. And we can say each of these circles represents one person or 100 people or 1 million people. It doesn't matter. This is how viruses spread in our community. And the yellow circles are the people who become infected, and the red are the ones that get severely ill. And you can see this one person goes on, if you follow the arrows, is able to pass it on from person to person until, in this picture, 16 people are infected and 3 are severely ill. And now if I could have the next slide. Oops, this lost its animation. So I'll just explain to you, whoop, go back up. I'll explain to you the whole picture. I had tried to make it easier by making it animated. But say we introduce, where that green line is, vaccine into this community. And the 3 green dots are the people who got vaccinated. So what you can see is that the yellow dots that infected them without vaccine can no longer infect them because they're protected. So that's what those little red X's mean. But then there's the concept of herd immunity. So what happens is they then can no longer pass the vaccine to the people. If they were unvaccinated and they had contact with, they would have passed it to them. And so the vaccine prevents people who were never vaccinated from becoming infected. So instead of 16 people who become infected in the top square, you only have 10 people, and you've doubled the number who were protected by 3 being protected by the vaccine itself and 3 by herd immunity, meaning they never got the vaccine, but because their friends and neighbors got vaccinated, they were protected and never became infected. And that's the concept of herd immunity, where we are vaccinating ourselves to protect ourselves and also to protect the people who we love and care about in the world. Next slide, please. But as RISHA said, there are disparities in the uptake of this vaccine. And that is something that concerns us because, first of all, it reflects our ability to convey information about the vaccine to the community so that they are trusting us and confident to take the vaccine. And 2, because we are leaving different groups of people more vulnerable. So you can see that the uptake is greatest in the Asian community. That's about 60%, but in the Black community, that is 33% right now. Overall in the US, we have about 50% coverage with the vaccine, but elderly people have really heard the message, and the rates of vaccination in those groups are really above 80%, and that is terrific news. Next, please. So this is the final message, and this message is that there are multiple systems that are ongoing in the US post-licensure, post-EUA, to look for any safety signals. So the original studies that were done in 30,000 people for each of these vaccines showed that they were safe, and that's where we learned about the efficacy of these vaccines. But post-licensure, when millions of people are getting the vaccine, that's when we're able to pick up rare side effects, and there are systems in place that will be very effective in telling us if there are any side effects. And I think that people need to keep in mind when you interpret side effects is that everything has a risk and a benefit that we do, and we weigh that risk and that benefit. So if there is a side effect that occurs in 1 or even 10 in a million doses, if you're protecting 90% of people from getting ill and 100% from getting severe disease, you've got to weigh those two things. Next slide. So finally, we've had considerable progress in high-income countries like the US in the control of COVID-19, but the pandemic is raging in the Southern Hemisphere, and this could predict another surge in the United States when the weather gets cool again, and we need to keep the vaccines up to date with boosters and other interventions that are being investigated so that we keep up with these variants. And the struggle against vaccine hesitancy, as Dr. IRVIN said, is really a struggle about trust and information and getting people the information that they need to make decisions for themselves and for the people that they love. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. KOTLOFF. That was such, that was an excellent presentation. I think one of the things that struck me was when you said that the original form of COVID-19 doesn't exist anymore. And it was sobering to hear about the emergence of different variants in lower income countries who are now grappling with higher rates of transmission and, as a consequence, death and grief. And so I also want to say that the comments that you made about herd immunity are some of the clearest I've ever heard. And I say this as someone who's trained in public health. So I really thank both of you for relaying such important information in such an accessible and passionate manner. And I know I speak for myself, but also for others who have the opportunity to listen in, that truly knowledge is power. And you both have equipped us with a lot of important knowledge this morning. So I want to pose a couple of questions, and I also will try to pose questions that are coming in from our audience members. I'm going to start first with you, Dr. IRVIN. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about is health equity and thinking about health equity in COVID-19 and beyond. How can we move towards health equity? What does that look like in this pandemic period and post-COVID?
Sure. I think one of the things that the pandemic has taught us, and, you know, some of us working in this field knew this, but I think some of the academic community partnerships that have been forged or strengthened through COVID-19 have been really important in terms of getting messaging to the community, but also making sure that academic centers and health centers understand kind of what the community needs, because the community knows. So I think we have to take that lens as we now try to focus on health disparities broadly. But I think the other issue, and, you know, Reverend Hickman often talks about this too, is the financial investment that's needed. So when we talk about being able kind of to really fund kind of community health and to work to dismantle systemic racism and health disparities, it requires, you know, kind of financial infrastructure, oftentimes that comes from kind of our government, but also from our health systems to engage in that as well. And having all of the players kind of on board in terms of state and local government, community-based organizations, the health centers, and kind of everyone uniting to work towards these goals.
I think that's such an interesting point you raised, because that whole idea of infrastructure, you know, leveraging resources and building capacity within communities, or I should say, amplifying the capacity they already have, is really important. And it actually links to the next question that I had for you, which is, what is being done to ensure vaccine access in Black and Brown communities?
Yeah, so I think both our, you know, our local city government in conjunction with community-based organizations and health centers have really made this transition from those mass vaccination sites, I think, which were great initially to try to give a lot of people access. But now when we think about who needs to be vaccinated, I think it's really working with communities to make things accessible and to be at sites that they trust, where they can hear from people that look like them, that they trust, and that they have relationships with. And so I think we've made that transition, and there are a lot of efforts now with mobile vaccine units, vaccine sites being set up at churches. Open Society is working with a lot of community-based organizations to help even more broadly roll out kind of vaccine efforts. And so I think all of those things have to continue to happen.
Thank you so much for sharing those insights. And a lot of what you said, to me, it applies so nicely to the work that Dr. KOTLOFF talked about. And I think for me personally, and I suspect audience members viewing this presentation may feel similarly, it was really intriguing to think about this in the context of being part of a global community. And Dr. KOTLOFF, you did such a nice job of explaining that because we are part of a global community, the fact that the pandemic is raging in lower income countries and that variants have emerged, that does need to be something that we here in the United States are concerned about. So one question that I have for you is, when you think about everything that you shared, what does that mean for how we here should approach decisions around getting vaccinated? I think you're on mute, Dr. KOTLOFF.
Thank you. Getting vaccinated is, to me, like wearing a seatbelt, like wearing a helmet when you're on a motorcycle or a bike. It is something that can reduce your risk of dying from COVID 100% and of getting ill from COVID by 90%. That means that if you were exposed and 100 people were exposed and would otherwise get infected, if they were vaccinated, only 10 would get infected and have mild symptoms, and none would have severe symptoms. And so getting vaccinated will protect you to some degree against all of the variants from what we know right now. And steps are being actively pursued to make protection against the variants as good as it is against the circulating strains that the vaccines were made for. And so you're just taking steps. Somebody is handing you this gift and says, we can protect you. If you can look at this and understand it and trust it, then you will be prepared to face whatever the virus is throwing at you. And the scientific community is doing everything that it can to keep up with what the virus is doing, to stay one step ahead of us.
Thank you so much for that clear explanation. I had a question for you, but I actually wanted to ask a question that someone else posed in the audience, because it is something I've been wondering myself. Ms. Paulette Jones asked, if the J&J vaccine's effectiveness is so low compared to Pfizer and Moderna, why is it being offered? And I've wondered the same and wanted to know your thoughts just based on your expertise in this arena.
So, the issue, it's a little bit nuanced. So this is a vaccine overall that is 72% effective, but it's just one dose. So the effectiveness is a bit less, but you only need to take one dose. And the effectiveness against severe disease is about 85%. So, the way these vaccines were rolled out is that in the US, 2 vaccines in each of the various types of vaccines were tested. And there were 2 vaccines, J&J and AstraZeneca, that used this viral base. So by having 6 different choices and 3 different types of vaccines, number one, you have a lot more vaccine that's available to the world. In many instances, one vaccine is all somebody can receive. If you're homeless, if you're in an area where you don't have deep freeze. So there are places where a single vaccine can be very helpful and save 85% of lives. I mean, it's not perfect, but that's still terrific. And so that's why it's still being offered, because we are citizens of the world, as we keep saying, and we need to get as much vaccine out there to help as many people as possible. And some have certain advantages, others have other advantages.
Thank you. That was such a helpful point of clarity, and I appreciate you sharing that, because within my own family, I've received questions similar to what Ms. Jones posed, and so I'm going to share with them what you just shared right now. I have a question actually for both of you. You both touched on health equity in terms of the disparate impact of COVID-19 in Black and Brown communities here in the US, and then vaccine distribution globally. What are your thoughts around things that we should be aware of in terms of either supporting vaccination efforts in poorer countries that are currently struggling, or just broader thoughts around COVID-19 and global health equity and the intersections between these things?
Dr. Irvin, do you want to take the first stab?
Sure. I mean, I guess what I would just say is that I think, COVID-19 should remind us all how we're interconnected. And the fact that, if vaccines are mostly available in high income countries and other countries don't get them, COVID-19 will persist. And the way our world is now, when you can be somewhere else within a couple of hours on an opposite side of the world, it will allow COVID-19 to continue to kind of spread. And also spread in communities, even in the US, where we have low vaccine uptake. So I think we have to be concerned about what happens across the world with COVID-19, and that we should all advocate, that our government support efforts to also make vaccines available in other countries as well.
Thank you.
Yes, I mean, I know that I don't want to take up too much time, but I think that the health inequities that occur in this country are compounded on a global scale. And so, when we talk about even the J&J vaccine not being quite as good, we have riches in terms of the vaccines that are available to us. If we could get the J&J vaccine and distribute it throughout sub-Saharan Africa, we would save millions of lives. And I think that we have to think about that every day.
Well, I can't thank you both enough for your presentations, for your thoughtful responses to the questions that were asked. And it's really been an honor moderating what has turned out to be, I think this is probably the best session out of all of them, but maybe the other sessions participants would disagree. But at this time, I'm going to invite the talented LINDSEY CHOUNG to join us. LINDSEY is a student selected for the exclusive 5-year bachelor's and master's degree program at the Peabody Conservatory at Johns Hopkins University, as well as the recipient of the James Winship Lewis Memorial Prize in Performance. LINDSEY has persevered and driven herself to strive for a successful musical career. She currently studies under M.P.H at the Peabody Conservatory of Music, with partial scholarship for her bachelor's in music and cello performance with a minor in liberal arts. Alongside her degree, LINDSEY is involved in several community outreach programs which bring music to homeless shelters, hospitals, schools, and other communities within Baltimore that have difficulty accessing live music. LINDSEY will be performing Bach Cello Suite No. 1 in G major, Prelude.
Hello everyone, my name is LINDSEY CHOUNG and I'm a sound rounds musician at the Johns Hopkins Hospital. I'm so grateful to have been invited here, and I want to congratulate STAR on its 30 years of service and on its 16th year of Why Women Cry. Today I'll be performing Bach's Cello Suite No. 1 in G major, the Prelude. And whenever I play this piece, I always think of spring, of plants growing, of animals coming out, and of fresh starts. I hope you enjoy, and I'm grateful to be here to present this music to you.
Wow, that was so beautiful. Thank you so much, Lindsay. That was such an incredible performance. And I think all of us who had the opportunity to listen to it feel so blessed to have been exposed to such beautiful music. At this time, I'm going to be turning it over to Demetrius Frazier and Kayla Wolford at Sisters Together and Reaching. Thanks for joining.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I want to say thank you again for joining us today for our third session. Thank you to all of our panelists, Dr. Ebay, Dr. Irving, Dr. KOTLOFF, and our cellist. You were great.
Amazing.
Amazing.
Great.
I think Kwame said pass the offering plate.
Pass the offering plate. Hallelujah. We have a hallelujah in the chat. Amen. Glory to God. Yes, ma'am. That was amazing. That was so amazing.
What did you take away from today?
Today, I took away that we need to take this virus absolutely seriously. Like, it's another surge coming in the winter. It's just, I've learned so much in my notes. Like, the original variant is no longer here.
Wow.
And we're basically fighting mutated variants of COVID-19. The original is gone. I did not know that.
Yes.
So it's just, it's scary, and it's a very pressing issue that we need to confront and need to talk about every day. Like, it's for forgetting that COVID is still out here, and it's so many people that's scared to get vaccinated. But we have all these other variants. You need to get vaccinated. At this point, it's like we have to. So that's my take. Thank you to our sponsors so much. Thank you.
Yes. So please make sure you join us next Wednesday, same time, 10 o'clock. We will be talking about mental health and depression. I think that's a great session, especially during this pandemic. Please make sure you join. If you know someone who has been dealing with depression, been dealing with the death, please make sure that you let them know about next week's session. Again, thank you all for joining. We look forward to seeing you all next week. Have a great and safe 4th of July weekend.